doing section 4, the end of the Vietnam War and its impact, I just want to say, whichever one of you yahoos is giving me the thumbs down on YouTube, that's not very nice, okay? Give me the thumbs up, or, you know, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, okay? Because I know that's probably you, my 7th hour class. I'm calling you guys out. I think it's you. I might be wrong, but that's what I think. Okay, anyhow, so let's get to the end of the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon, he is going to gradually pull out American troops, and this will be on your worksheet, and this process is called Vietnamization, trying to have the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, actually do more of the fighting than the Americans were doing, okay? And the Army of the Republic of North Vietnam, aka the South Vietnamese, they're going to start playing the major combat roles. But while Nixon is saying, hey, we're going to scale back, hey, you know, we're going to have the North or the South Vietnamese fight, at the same time, he starts doing something a little bit shady in the eyes of the American people. He's going to start secretly bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, now here is Vietnam right here, and right next to it we have Cambodia. Cambodia is a country that's they're not involved in this war. But there is a network of trails and roads through Cambodia that the North Vietnamese use to funnel supplies to South Vietnam. Okay, and on your worksheet, when it asks about this, the reason that we start bombing this Ho Chi Minh Trail is to try and, you know, stop the flow of communist supplies to South Vietnam. That's the plan. But it's a super controversial move because we're supposed to be scaling back, but here we are expanding the Vietnam War into another country. And so that was why it was controversial, because some of the American people, they weren't a fan of that. Okay, so that's just going to add to President Nixon's troubles. I mean, first of all, he inherited this unpopular war, okay? And it's not just unpopular, there's a lot of people who aren't afraid to tell you their opinions about it being unpopular, okay? The anti-war protesters at this time, they're like your grandma, okay? And you guys know what I'm talking about. You got that grandma, and she's not afraid to say what she thinks, because she's like, I'm old, I can say whatever I want, and nobody can do anything about it, okay? That's the anti-war protesters right now. And Nixon's having to deal with that. And when you add on Cambodia to that, you know, telling everyone we're going to prevent the spread of communism, that's kind of iffy. Okay, now there is a communist uprising going on in Cambodia led by the Khmer Rouge, which is a movement led by this awful guy named Pol Pot, who was responsible for this huge genocide that killed over 2 million people in Cambodia. You should look him up. He's probably on the top 10 list of most evil people in the history of the world. But that's another topic. Okay, so once people start to find out about these bombings of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we're going to have a whole new string of protests. And one of these is going to take place at Kent State University, which is in Ohio. Okay, and what we have here is a group of college students who are protesting, and they have to bring in the National Guard for this anti-war protest. Well, the protesters, they start throwing rocks and bottles at the National Guard. One of the guardsmen thinks he hears a gunshot, and he's like, oh my gosh, they're firing on us. So naturally, they fire back. When it's all said and done, 4 of the students are killed, and this picture up here is one of the most famous photographs of this particular incident. And unfortunately, this was not the only instance where we had death on a college campus because of protests. Another university, Jackson State University, it's a very similar situation. We had 2 students who were killed in a protest on this college campus. Okay, so I mean, it's not just people voicing their opinions, people are getting violent about this. Okay, and the dislike of the war in Vietnam, there's some events that are going to happen that don't help that situation at all. The first of these is the My Lai massacre, which actually took place in 1968, but the American people don't find out about it until 1971. American soldiers, they were supposed to go into this village in South Vietnam because they thought that these Viet Cong rebels, these guerrilla fighters were there. And so, they're going to try and take these guys out. They're going to be led by a guy named Lieutenant Calley. Okay? Once they get there, Lieutenant Calley basically tells them, hey, just go kill all these people, essentially. What happens is 400 to 500 civilians were killed. Were some of them probably Viet Cong? Yeah. We don't know who was the Viet Cong and who wasn't, honestly. We couldn't tell. We always had trouble telling. But the fact of the matter is, there were a lot of unarmed women, children, infants, elderly who were killed as well. And a lot of the women were raped by American soldiers, unfortunately. Some Americans, they did act honorably in these situations. There's evidence that there were several helicopter pilots who dropped down and they got civilians and they took them out of harm's way. There were some American soldiers who didn't follow the orders and, massacre these civilians. But it happened. And then the United States government and the Army, they tried to cover it up because, you don't want people to know about that. It's embarrassing. It's a disgrace. And so, like I said, some of them were probably Viet Cong, but a lot of them were not. And so the story, the public didn't really know about it until 1971 when it was leaked to Time magazine. Okay? There was one of the Army photographers, he took photographs with the Army camera, and when he did that, he took photographs of, them negotiating with hostages or people they took as prisoner and, things like that, everything that was by the book. But this Army photographer, he had his own personal camera, and he took pictures of the atrocities that happened. And this is what was published in Time magazine. Pictures of the dead bodies that were piled up, just strings of innocent people being shot at point blank range. These are the pictures that Americans saw. Okay, and so when that comes out, it wasn't good. Lieutenant Calley, who was in charge of this, he was court-martialed. He was sentenced to life in prison for his role in it, but he was later paroled and released from prison because a lot of people thought he was a scapegoat. I don't know. Look it up and, kind of investigate it yourself and see what you think. Okay, but in addition to the My Lai massacre, we have another thing that comes out that really hurts the government, the Pentagon Papers. And this does not help the credibility gap. Okay, basically, this was published in the New York Times, and it was information that showed that, and it says on your worksheet when it talks about the Pentagon Papers, that U.S. leaders misled Congress and the American people about the war. That's what the Pentagon Papers revealed. It was a study that was done, and the government actually did the study. But it showed that U.S. leaders, they lied to Congress. They didn't fully tell the truth to the American people. And, you can't do that. You can't, I realize that the president doesn't always disclose everything to the American people for safety reasons. We get that. But you can't go and lie to Congress so you can get what you want. For instance, President Johnson, there's evidence that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave him the powers to send troops into Vietnam, that was drafted before the incident even took place, where the USS Maddox was fired on, that called for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So there's evidence that, we were trying to find ways to get into Vietnam. And that's not what the American people wanted to hear. So again, credibility gap, not good. Okay? But in October of 1972, Richard Nixon realizes, hey, I'm running for re-election. I'm not going to get re-elected president unless I resolve this war. So he gets peace negotiations going with the people of Vietnam, and they actually draw up a settlement. Woohoo! Okay? And then Nixon gets re-elected. But wouldn't you know, after he gets re-elected, the peace negotiation falls apart. The North Vietnamese, they refuse to sign the agreement. Okay? And so the United States, Richard Nixon is like, dadgum you, you're going to sign this agreement. So he starts bombing North Vietnam to try and convince them to enter into negotiations. And they did. Which leads us to the Paris Peace Accords, which took place in January of 1973. This is where North Vietnam, South Vietnam,